All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Michael Dean. You're watching the Prince Podcast. And before we continue, please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button down below and check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/podcastjuice. All right, with that, let's work it like a job. Peace.
PodcastJuice.net.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Prince Podcast. My name is Michael Dean. Joining me today, my cohorts, if I'm saying that correctly, but
You're not.
I'm not. That's what I do. But joining me today, as you heard his voice, Mr. Big Sexy and Sax. Sir, how are you?
Doing great, man. Had a good week. Had some music news of my own working on. So, yeah, it's a good time today. Ready to roll.
All right. And also joining us, he hasn't been back on the mic with us in quite a bit, but he's one of the OG co-hosts of the Prince Podcast, Mr. Big Ken. Sir, how you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Happy to be on the show with you guys. In the immortal words of Ice Cube, today is a good day.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you already know, because you're listening to this and you see the title on the website and you know what this show is going to be about. But joining us today, we have a man that for Prince fans out there, and for me particularly, his sound of his saxophone playing is so synonymous with Prince music. It's hard for me to separate the two. If I don't hear his stuff on some Prince stuff, it ain't the real Prince stuff in mine. That's just how I roll. But joining us today, Mr. Eric Leeds. Sir, how are you?
I'm just doing fine, Michael. Thank you so much for asking me to join you today.
Man, thank you for coming on. And I would be remiss, I have to do this and shout out Matthew Bale. He helped sort of get this thing going, so I want to make sure I shout him out. Big Mr. Matthew Bale, sir. Thank you. All right. Okay, so let me get some of these things out of the way first so that I can do this interview. There's something I've been saying all week as I've been preparing for this, and I just got to say to you, Mr. Leeds, because this is how I get down right now, and I'm excited. Eric, blow your horn. Okay. Now I'm done.
That was almost like a Pavlovian dog thing when I used to hear that. I could be half asleep. I hear that. Oh shit! I got to get to work.
I love it. Yes, sir. Man, I've listened to so many recordings of the shows and rehearsals and stuff, and just like, you guys are killing it. And we're gonna be all over the place today, but I'm gonna make sure we start at the beginning. First of all, is it cool if I call you Eric? I almost feel like I'm.
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm still too young to have to be called Mr. Leeds.
All right, because I'm like you guys to me, man, like superheroes. So I don't know, if, Mr. Superman or Mr. Leeds. I don't know what.
Well, that's how I was with all the cats that I grew up with James Brown.
Okay, see.
There
you go.
James Brown was always Mr. Brown to me.
Yes, Mr. Brown. That was that respect that had to be put forth. So, man, I'm glad you brought up Mr. Brown, James Brown. I want to take us back, though, because I know your brother, Alan Leeds, and hopefully one day I can talk with him. But take me back to where you come from, your origins. Where were you born? Where are you from?
I was actually born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My father is from New York, and Alan was born in New York. My mother, coincidentally, is from St. Paul, Minnesota, Twin Cities. So it was kind of ironic that both Alan and I would end up living in the Twin Cities where my mother was born. And she had moved to New York when she was young. That's where she met my father. But my dad was a department store retailer, so we kind of moved around a lot. So I was born in Milwaukee. But we only lived there until I was like 7 years old, and then we moved to Richmond, Virginia. We were there for about 7 or 8 years, and that's where Alan began his career, first in radio. And then when I was in junior high school, we moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and that's where I went to high school, and that's where I went to music school, and that's where my career began, and I lived in Pittsburgh from like 1966 through around 1983.
Wow.
So that's where the bulk of my career was. That's where where I had my own bands and played all around Pittsburgh for years and years. And then I think it was 83. I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, for a couple of years, and
Okay.
it was the next year, and was in '84 that I began working with Prince.
What got you into picking up an instrument?
Ray Charles.
Ah.
Yeah, I mean that was my Prince.
Okay.
I mean I had. My Alan was really into R&B music when he was like 9 or 10 years old, and I'm 5 years younger than Alan. So I was exposed to this music because of Alan at a very, very young age. And the first cats that I could really remember digging were cats like Little Richard, Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, all the the icons of the origins of R&B and rock and roll. But by the time I was about 8 or 9 years old, Alan had discovered Ray Charles, and that was it for me.
Wow.
And it was his music, and particularly the cat who was his primary saxophone soloist, a cat named David Fathead Newman, and that's why I play the horn. I mean,
Wow.
it was really, now it could have ended up being somebody else a few years later or whatever, but that was the first music that really, really just so captured my imagination at such a young age. And then hearing that saxophone of this guy, David Newman, was just so when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I just decided, maybe I want to try to do that.
Wow. And it's important. I want to, stress, like, putting things into context. Now, you brought up Ray Charles. Now, for a lot of younger listeners and people my age as well, they'll think back to the Jamie Foxx movie of Ray.
Sure.
And you said Ray was my Prince. So can you just shed a little light to us and give us a little history of what did Ray Charles mean at that time that you would say he was your Prince?
At that time, you have to understand that the whole scope of what we talk about in the music that we're talking about now, whether you want to call it rock and roll, R&B, or whatever, it was the culmination, particularly after World War II, when we think of the early rock and roll days. It was really the sociological phenomenon of young white Americans discovering finally and really bringing into their lives the music of Black America, because that's what this music is. Mm-hmm. Ray Charles was he was almost like a Renaissance man, because Ray Charles had a very, very deep jazz background. If all Ray Charles had done was play jazz, he would have been very well known and accomplished for that. But he was also a blues musician, and he also had a very heavy gospel influence. Now, at that time, particularly in the Black community, there was a very big distinction between what it meant to play pop music or blues and gospel music. And Ray Charles was somebody that took the vocabulary of gospel, Black gospel music, and jazz and blues, and really looked at it as just two sides of the same coin. And for very conservative people at that time, they thought it was heresy that somebody would take gospel-infused music but put blues lyrics on it. So even in the Black community, it was somewhat revolutionary at that time. And he was well known, particularly among Black Americans, before he became known to young white Americans. And it was really a song of his called "What I Say" that became one of the most iconic songs in the history of American pop music, that kind of began to cross him over. I think that it was as much his jazz, the jazz component of his music, which affected me, because really jazz, while I was listening to a lot of rock and roll and R&B, But it was at the same age that I was getting into Ray Charles, I was also getting into jazz, and that's really the music that captured my imagination more than anything else, at least as somebody that, is the music that kind of inspired me to want to play a musical instrument. But the vocabulary of what I say became the vocabulary of American music, Ray Charles is one of the most significant people in the history of this music. First of all, his vocal style, the way he just approached any song, the way he sang. There isn't anybody in pop music today, I don't care who they are, who doesn't take from the vocabulary and the instruction book. If you're going to sing pop music, whether it's, I don't care if you're Beyonce or even a Britney Spears or anybody, whether you know it or not, so much of what you know how to do with your voice in service of this music came from people like Ray Charles. Without Ray Charles, there is nothing. He was that significant as a musical contributor to the legacy. So much of what happened in music came from just his disciples. Certainly Stevie Wonder is one of the most essential musical personas and contributors to what we call American pop music. But without Ray Charles, there's no Stevie Wonder. I mean, it was that significant. I can think of when you look at particularly the contributors to the vocabulary of the music, the only person historically I think that was as essential as Ray Charles was James Brown.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just jumping here quickly. Did you ever get a chance to meet Ray Charles by any chance?
No, I never did.
Okay.
My brother did very briefly once. But I was, just way too young in those days. I mean, I don't think I was even, I don't think I was. It was several years after I was really in love with Ray's music that I even had an opportunity to hear him before live.
Okay.
Hear him perform live. I was way too young to be going to concerts then.
So when now, what age did your brother Alan, did he sort of go off? And you said he started into radio, and I assume that sort of.
He was starting, well, like I say, we were living in Richmond, Virginia, and there was one R&B station in Richmond. It was called WANT Radio, and that's what. And it was a daytime only station. I mean, it would have to. It signed off every evening at sundown. And Alan started. He just one day. I guess he was about 17 years old. He just went down to the station one day. And just went in there and just started to meet people. I mean, he was just like, here I am, And he actually, over a period of time, became very, very close friends with several of the guys, some of the younger guys that were DJs and working at that station. And literally within several months after that, Alan kind of wiggled his way into getting on the air. Like on a Saturday afternoon or whatever. And anyway, that was kind of his entrance into the world of music. But I mean, literally, he was like 17 or 18 years old by the time I think by the time he was 18 years old, he had his own Saturday morning show on the station.
All right. Yeah. What and now you guys are from Pittsburgh at this point. You talk about a white cast getting into black music, but what was it like? When did you start first playing out? And what kind of places did you play?
I started playing the horn when I was in grade school, and I was just in like grade school bands and things like that. But I was taking private lessons from a saxophone teacher in Richmond right away. I really didn't make a final determination that I was really going to pursue music as a career until I was in, I would say, junior high school, maybe like 9th or 10th grade, when I really finally decided that this is something I was going to want to pursue as a career, and that once I graduated from high school, that I wanted to go to music school after that. I guess I started... I had a little kiddie band when I was in Richmond when I was 13, 14 years old. and we used to play maybe dances at school or something like that. Maybe once, twice a year or something. But I started, I graduated from high school in 1970 and immediately went into music school after that. And I was in all the main ensembles, the jazz ensemble, the symphony band, the saxophone quartet. I started, and I was in bands, with friends of mine, just, jam bands or whatever. We might play a gig here and there. But my professional career, I guess, started probably around 1971, 72. My first jazz band that I had in Pittsburgh in 1972, while I was 20 years old, we started playing club gigs around Pittsburgh, and in December of 1972, we were the opening act for a concert featuring the iconic band Weather Report, which was probably one of the most, Weather Report. Weather Report as a band was probably, by that time, Miles Davis and that music and Weather Report, that more than anything else defined what I aspired to be as a musician, more than anything, and more than any other music.
Wow. And you said that was in 71?
72. Weather Report formed in 71, and it was, I think, December of 72 that my first, my band opened up a concert for them. It was a concert featuring them and Ross and Roland Kirk, who was also one of the preeminent jazz saxophone players of that era.
So I'm just curious, and then I'm going to go to Big Ken for a question. So when you do that show, I mean, how did you feel? Were you intimidated, or you like, no, we're ready to be up here?
Oh, I was scared to death.
Okay.
I mean, it was like I'm driving to the gig that night, and I'm realizing that the people who are paying money to hear the music that night, they're going to hear three saxophone players. They're going to hear Wayne Shorter, who's one of the most iconic tenor saxophonists and composers in the history of progressive music. Ross and Roland Kirk, who was also one of the greatest tenor saxophone players in the history of the music, and then they were going to hear me. And I'm thinking, oh, maybe I'll just turn around and drive home. No, I mean, we were thrilled to death. But yeah, I mean, intimidated, hell yeah. But now I had been into Weather Report for a year, since they had formed the year before. But this was my first time to hear them perform. So I was just absolutely looking, just thrilled that I was finally going to hear this tremendous band that I had fallen in love with. Mm-hmm. But to also have my own band be the opening act on that band was just beyond belief for me. And of course, what capped it off is that at the end of the night, as we played our half-hour set, and then Weather Report played, and then Roland Kirk played, and I'm in just seventh heaven because these are heroes of mine. And at the end of the gig, I'm packing up my horns, and I look up, and there's Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul, who was the keyboard player and the co-leader with him of Weather Report, who was another hero of mine. And they asked me and the other members of my band, they said, you were the guys who were the first band this evening, right? And I said, yeah. And he came up and walked up to me and shook my hand and said, I'm a 20-year-old kid. And they looked at me and said, you guys keep doing what you're doing because you guys got it. You know what you're doing. You're going to have a great career. You keep at it. Wow. Now, I mean, that's something I'll never forget. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was like, that was a game changer for me.
Right. That's sort of like confirmation, like, okay, we on the set.
Yeah. Because I was expecting, well, maybe he's going to come back and just like pat me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, kid, don't quit your day job."
Hilarious. Big Ken, man, you had a question.
Yeah, I mean, he actually pretty much answered it. I was thinking to myself that Ray Charles was your main influence, and particularly you got into Fathead Newman, which to me sounded like Fathead Newman was your gateway into jazz.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because Fathead was one of those rare cats that was a tremendous jazz player, but also played R&B. Mm-hmm. And with the same level of passion. Because there were, the world of jazz is littered with the horrible attempts at jazz cats to like dumb down their music in order to try to make it pop. Mm-hmm. And 9 times out of 10 that doesn't work because so many jazz cats really just don't feel pop music or R&B. But for somebody like a Fathead Newman and the cats that played with Ray Charles and the Maceo Parkers and the Fred Wesleys and the Pee Wee Ellis and those cats that played with James Brown, these were all jazz cats that could equally bring that same passion to R&B and funk. And that's what kind of defined me, because jazz and R&B and funk were just, for me, kind of two sides of the same coin.
Right. Did you? Yeah. It sounds to me also like, I mean, you're big into the fusion and electric jazz. I mean, that's also a favorite
absolutely.
period of mine, especially the Electric Miles, that whole era with Weather Report, Return of Forever, all that. Did you gravitate to?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I mean, that's really the music. I'd gotten into Miles, of course, and I was deep into Coltrane and all the really all of that stuff. But in the late '60s, you were starting to hear that the music wanted to progress from just the more mainstream acoustic swing jazz into music that was going to utilize electric instruments and duple meter rhythms, which were rock and R&B and funk rhythms. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of jazz players that were getting into that, cast like Charles Lloyd particularly. But when Miles really embraced all of that, and particularly with his albums In a Silent Way and then Bitches Brew, that's the music that really, when I brought Bitches Brew home and listened to that, it was like, okay, now I get it. Now I know what I'm going to try to, what if left to my own devices, this is what I want to be.
I understand completely. So I would assume then as well that you probably got into the second great quintet that he was doing in the late '60s prior to In a Silent Way.
Absolutely.
Sorcerer, Nefertiti, all those albums.
Oh, I used to take those albums, back in the days when turntables were changers, where you could stack albums and just let them drop one after the other.
Yeah.
I used to take all of those albums, from ESP to Miles Smiles to Sorcerer, Nefertiti, Miles in the Sky, Kilimanjaro. I just used to stack those and play those albums over and over again.
Wow. I completely understand.
Now, at the same time, I do the same thing with all of Coltrane's albums.
Because I was going to ask you, so who would you rank the best? Train, Sonny Rollins, Wayne Shorter, Roland Kirk? Who's tops for Eric Leeds?
Well, from a standpoint of the most significant contributor to the vocabulary and what's possible to do with the tenor saxophone, Coltrane was, no one revolutionized what could be done with the instrument as much as Coltrane did. But at the same time, he was somebody that was revolutionizing the music with his conception of how, and the quartet that he had with McCoy and Elvin and Jimmy Garrison, because that was like, it was his significance for the music was not just as the saxophone player was as he was. It was equally as much as the conceptualist, the composer that he was. Equally the same thing with Miles. Miles probably doesn't get all of the respect that he deserves just as being a trumpet player, but even as the trumpet player, because as a trumpet player he kind of transcended the instrument, because he's really equally and even more significant for what he brought to the conception of the music as a composer, and just what he did with just how the music evolved. So certainly as a saxophone player, Coltrane is certainly at the epitome for me in that respect. Now, as far as just my own personal taste, along with Coltrane, obviously Fathead. Roland Kirk was one of my prime influences, and of course Wayne Shorter. But there were other cats, Cannonball Adderley. I can't imagine my life as a saxophone player without the music of Cannonball Adderley and his band. He was one of the few alto players that was a huge influence on me as a tenor and baritone player. But the tenor player that played with Cannonball Adderley and his band for several years, Yusuf Lateef, was a cat from Detroit who was huge influence on me personally. I just absolutely loved his sound. But then, there were so many other cats, like Pharoah Sanders is one of the most significant tenor men for me, as Archie Shepp was, as Gatto Barbieri was, as Joe Henderson, Stan Getz. Later on, of course, Joe Farrell and David Lehman, these cats that came up in the 70s. Over the past 25, 30 years, flat out, the most significant saxophone player to me, hands down, is Branford. I mean, there is no one playing the saxophone now for me that I want to hear more than Branford at any given point.
Interesting.
That's my guy. That is like that's my guy.
Right. I think he just played here in Seattle.
Aside from that, I'm honored to say that Branford and I have been very good friends for quite a while now. But
Nice.
That's a name I love to drop. But Branford's a friend of mine. Yeah, that's like,
you name dropping. Huh?
That's my cat. Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
Wow. I'm playing Prince right now, so I'm just throwing these different cues. Squirrel meat.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. Yeah.
Whatever that was supposed to mean to you guys, I'm jumping. I see you, Ken, doing your thing. Let's see. Also, wanted to get into again another question, sort of about Alan and James Brown, and
Sure.
sort of how what that meant to you when he starts to work with Mr. Brown. Do you have an opportunity? When is the opportunity that you get to go in there and see from an insider's perspective? I don't know if you got to sit in on a rehearsal or saw shows from the side.
I first met James when Alan was working at that radio station, because he actually knew James for several years before he started working with him. Because in those days, the business model of what it was like to be, an entertainer, a performer, particularly R&B music, but the primary relationship was between the artist and the DJ. Because back in those days, it was really about getting your records played on the radio. And James Brown was extremely smart in forming relationships with DJs all over the country. And as a young DJ coming up in a market, Richmond was not a big city, but it was a very, very important market in R&B radio, because it was the next large metropolis just south of Washington. And until you got down to Atlanta, Richmond was a very, very important market in R&B music at that time. So James Brown would play Richmond maybe sometimes in the mid to late 60s, maybe sometimes 2-3 times a year. So Alan got to know James because James was very interested in having relationships with all of the young DJs, because he realized my ability to sell records and perform is completely dependent on whether the radio stations are playing my records.
Okay.
So Alan got to know James at a very young age, and so very fortunately, I did too. So I got to start to hang out with James and his band when they would come to Richmond in as early as like 1965, 1966. And I'm 14 years old.
Wow.
And I got the chance to, be at sound. Well, there weren't really sound checks in those days, because the PA systems in concert halls those days really existed like maybe 2 microphones. That was about it. But there might be a rehearsal before the gig, and I'd get the opportunity to sit backstage. So I mean, that's kind of it's kind of where I lost my musical virginity, because I mean when you get the opportunity to stand on the side of a stage, and a lot of times during the gigs, the actual performances, I wouldn't be out in the audience, I'd be standing on the side of the stage.
Okay.
And I get the opportunity to see, James had 3 drummers. He'd carry 3 drummers, and they all had, there were 3 kits, 3 drum sets. And on certain songs, all 3 of those drummers were playing together.
Wow.
And when you stand on the side of the stage and hear those 3 drummers kicking, and that was like John Starks, Jabbo, Clyde Stubblefield, and whoever the 3rd drummer might be, and you hear, and you hear that iconic rhythm section, and with like 9 or 10 horns, and I'm 14 years old, and my jaw is just dropped into the floor, and I'm just saying, oh my God,
Wow.
What in the world is this? So yeah, I had that absolutely wonderful opportunity to be around James Brown, and look, it was like after a gig, James Brown would go in his dressing room and he'd hold court for several hours.
Really?
With people, fans that would come in, but DJs and all kinds of people, and I'd get to hang out with him in his dressing room after gigs like that. And he'd always have a test pressing of whatever his next single was. And I remember, for example, years later, by the time we had lived in Pittsburgh, and I remember one night, I guess it was around 1968 or something, so now I'm like 17 years old. And he was in Pittsburgh, and I'm hanging out with them backstage, and in his dressing room. And I'd have to pinch myself. I said, "Oh my God, I'm sitting here in a room with James Brown. He just got off the stage, playing and kicking in front of 12,000 people." And he'd look at me, and my nickname when I was a kid, I didn't go by the name Eric. I went by the name Rick. So he knew me as Rick. So he'd say to me, "Rick, how you doing?" And I said, "Mr. Brown, great show. Glad to be here." And he said, "Rick, hold on." He'd always have a little record player in the dressing room with him, a little portable stereo player, record player that he carried with him. And he said, "Hold on, Rick, got something to play for you." And he pulled out a test pressing, and he put it on. It was a let's give it up or turn it loose.
Yeah.
And like he said, "This is the new one." And I'm thinking, it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks before anybody else hears this. But here I am, like a 16-year-old kid sitting in his dressing room, and he's looking at me because he wants to see the reaction on my face. And I'm like, my face is just like, I'm beaming. I said, "This is the new one, huh?" He said, "Yep." And I said, "Mr. Brown, got another hit here." Like I'm telling him something he didn't know, but So yeah, those were the experiences that I obviously will treasure.
Wow. For a lot of people, you could be done at that point. Like,
absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew. But I'm glad you're sharing this, because this really puts everything in perspective as we move forward. But, the setup, so, man, here you are, you with James playing you unreleased joints. Like, yeah, what you think about that? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, we'll fast forward a little bit here. Your brother goes on to work with Mr. James as in his organization.
He was one of his national tour directors from the late '60s through the early '70s for about, I guess, a 3 or 4 year period there.
Oh, and that reminds me, I wanted to ask you, the James Brown movie "Get It Up" that came out a few years ago. Now, I love that movie, but I'm curious, what did you think about that movie?
I've never seen it.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Now that may say that says a lot, or maybe it doesn't.
To be absolutely honest with you, it's one of these things I'll probably catch up with one day. There was a documentary that was released on HBO.
Yes, that was excellent.
At the same time, the documentary, of course, Alan is one of the primary talking heads in that documentary, along with Questlove and Christian McBride and Maceo and others. The documentary was absolutely just fabulous. Yes. I thought that was just one of the finest pieces that have ever been done. I am somebody that, because there isn't anything about the James Brown story I don't know.
Okay.
And having had the opportunity to have been around him, it's just not necessary for me to go see somebody pretend to be James Brown, even though they may have done it very well.
Right.
There wasn't anything that I was going to get from that movie that I didn't already know. So it wasn't. I just didn't feel it was essential for me to have to. I never saw the Ray Charles biopic.
Really?
I saw clips from it, and Jamie Foxx did an absolute phenomenal job of impersonating Ray Charles. But I don't need to see that.
Okay.
that doesn't do me any good. I have all the Ray Charles music.
I understand.
I have Ray Charles in my home.
I hear you.
So,
I hear you.
Yeah.
That's funny, because I can probably see, if they ever, and I'm sure they would, because Hollywood is what it is, there will be a Prince movie at some point, and I'm sure a lot of fans will probably have a very similar sort of, I don't need to, like, it's not Prince, so it would be like, I can go watch the real thing as opposed to, the movie version.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
okay.
But,
I was just curious.
But I suspect you're right. I suspect there will one day be a biopic on him. I just assume that that's a given. Yeah.
All right. Well, okay. So James, I wanted to get to the point where the Prince connection comes in. I know Alan goes and works with Prince. I believe the 1999 tour.
That's what he started on. And here's a curious small world thing. Alan had left Pittsburgh and moved to New York in the early 80s, I guess around 1980, 81, and he was in New York. and he got a gig being the road manager for the band Kiss.
Mm-hmm.
And now that is not kind of an anomaly for Alan, because that's not a band of music that Alan would have any interest in listening to particularly. But he needed a gig, and he got a gig going out as a road manager for Kiss. Coincidentally, the production manager for that tour, for the Kiss tour, was a guy named Tommy Marzullo, who actually was from Pittsburgh. And Tommy Marzullo actually was aware of who I was because he used to come out and listen to bar bands that I played in. But coincidentally, at the same time that this Kiss tour was out, the 1999 tour was out on the road. And the same guy, Tommy Marzullo, had actually been the production manager for the 1999 tour at the same time. So Alan had already become a fan of Prince's music and was very interested in Prince. Tommy came to Alan on the Kiss tour and mentioned that the road manager for Prince's tour had just been fired for whatever reason. Prince had a reputation for going through road managers like people go through underwear, apparently.
Wow. Okay.
So anyway, Alan asked Tommy. He said, "Gee, now that's something that I would be interested in, maybe having a hookup with Prince." And Tommy said, "Well, let me see what's up." So Tommy came back to Alan and he said, "I think I could introduce you to Prince's manager and maybe get you the gig with Prince." Only thing is that Alan still had a few weeks to go with this Kiss tour. Well, Gene Simmons came to Alan and said, "You got an opportunity to go out on the rest of the Prince tour, and they're going to be out for another month or so. Our tour only has another couple weeks to go, and pretty much everything is in place. We can cut you loose, and you can go see if you can get the gig with Prince," which was absolutely a wonderful thing for Gene Simmons to have done at that point. So Alan basically left the Kiss tour. 2 days later, he's with Prince, and that began his relationship with Prince. So,
wow. Well, shout out to Gene Simmons then. Because,
yeah, really. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So when Alan goes to work with Prince, and then of course, Purple Rain comes out, and it's a whole other show to talk about Purple Rain, but I wanted to get to the point where Alan mentions Prince, and say, "Hey, my brother, saxophone player."
Right. Well, the time this was let me see, this is summer of 1984. Purple Rain, the album had just come out. The movie had not yet come out. The movie was about a month before the movie was premiered, but the album had just come out, and the time broke up. Mm-hmm. Morris had split. Morris Day had split. He was out of the picture, and so the group was just coming apart. And Prince was determined, I think, to want to have another group that he would produce that would kind of like maybe take up where the time left off. An R&B oriented band, but Prince did specifically come up with the idea of having the lead singers be white kids. It was almost like a business decision. I said, I can take R&B music and put a different face on it and maybe broaden the appeal of what this music might be to a wider audience if I infuse it with just enough of a pop sensibility that could be true to both music. So that was kind of the idea behind it. Now, regardless of that, it for whatever reason, Prince decided that he wanted to have a saxophone involved in this music. And he had mentioned that just happened, I guess, in passing to Alan. At which point, of course, Alan just said to him, I said, "Well, coincidentally, I just happen to know somebody that plays the horn." So I guess at that point, Alan gave Prince a cassette or something of me playing something or other. So, and there was, fortunately, Prince told Alan, he said, "Call your brother." and tell him that, bring him up here. So,
what was that first meeting like with Prince?
First of all, just to give you a little bit of background to kind of set it up, I was not a fan of Prince's music, particularly. I had very, very little knowledge of his music. I didn't own any of his albums. I did have the 1999 album, and I listened to it once or twice, and that was about it. I liked the song 1999. There really wasn't anything else on that album that really appealed to me particularly. So I really had very, very little knowledge other than what, Alan had been telling me about Prince. But there was really, it just wasn't something that necessarily had resonated with me. A couple of songs of his, like I liked When Doves Cry, like 1999. Really, that was about it, because I had no knowledge of any of his other recordings.
Had you ever seen him live at that point? Had you seen him play?
No, never.
Okay.
Never had. First time I ever saw a Prince performance was actually the movie Purple Rain.
Oh, okay.
In the movie. So at that point, I had no expectations or illusions about what this might become for me. And actually, Alan it took Alan a couple of weeks to convince me that it was something that I should be interested in. Like I said, by then I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was at a point in my career. I had been in bar bands for a lot of years, and I was kind of burned out by that. So I was at a point in my life where I was really kind of not sure where I wanted to go next musically. Okay. And I didn't feel that I had quite the necessary skill set to enable me to really excel. I wasn't ready to pack up my horn and go to New York and jump in the jazz scene and try to see if I could, survive. I really didn't think that I was at a point that I was going to do that. So I was really kind of, at a turning point. So all of a sudden, this opportunity just completely falls in my lap, because playing with an artist like Prince and playing with that kind of music was nothing that I really ever aspired to. It was never that I ever thought, well, this is a direction in music that I want to go into. It was nothing that really, I had really thought of.
Quick question, Eric. What did
sure.
At that time, what did you see Prince's music as? You said this kind of music. I was curious what you mean.
It was just pop music to me.
Okay.
With like I say, I really didn't have much depth of knowledge of what. So the songs the several songs of his that I had heard, was just, okay, here's a pop guy that obviously has a different sound. His singing, the manner of the sound of his group is certainly distinctive. But for example, I could listen to a song like Little Red Corvette and certainly recognize that, okay, here's an absolutely masterful piece of pop songwriting and production. I mean, that's just an absolute phenomenal piece of pop music. That just wasn't the kind of music that I listened to.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it just like no more. Like I mean, I go back and I could say that in all of the music that I've talked about, I've never mentioned, for example, the Beatles. Now, how are you going to be somebody growing up in the '60s, getting into music, and not be exposed to any and everything that the Beatles did?
Right.
Now, there is music of the Beatles that I absolutely love, but there's an awful lot of Beatles music that I could care less about, No,
I understand you.
So, and at the same time that I was, in the late 60s and early 70s, the music that I was listening to, at that same time, you had iconic groups like the Grateful Dead, Led Zeppelin, The Who, bands like that. I wasn't into that music at all. Okay. I mean, that stuff was just not even on my radar screen. So I looked at Prince as like, okay, obviously there is an R&B and funk component to this music, but it ain't funk like George Clinton. And that's what,
I'm going to let Eric say that.
I ain't touching it.
Yeah.
No, I hear you.
And to be honest, in the early '80s, the my iconic pop artist in the early '80s was Kid Creole and the Coconuts.
Oh wow.
That's what I loved.
Okay.
So I saw Prince as, well, he's just a little too pop for me. Now Alan is telling me, he said, look, you got to understand something. This guy is a remarkable musician. And I said, if you get involved with him, I am sure you're going to find something that is going to be so fascinating and worthwhile for you to be a part of. And that's what I held on to. I said, okay. It was kind of an open book. So I had no reason to say, oh, this cat's just he's going to be like just a one joke act. No, it was like, so I said, okay, cool. If Alan is telling me that, then that means something, because I know enough about Alan's understanding of the music and so much about the music that I was introduced to and fell in love with was because of Alan. I may have never even become a musician if I hadn't been introduced to that music at such a young age because Alan was into it. So that was worth my while to come up here. Now, coincidentally, I also, like I said, my mother was from the Twin Cities, and we used to visit in the Twin Cities when I was a kid because I had an aunt and uncle that lived in the Twin Cities. I had cousins, and I hadn't seen them in a long time. So I said, okay, cool, I'll come up to Minneapolis. I'll get a chance to spend time with my aunt and uncle, my cousins I haven't seen. And, oh, yeah, I'm going to go in a recording studio and do something with this guy, Prince, and we'll see what happens.
Wow. It's interesting the way you sort of framing this, and you being a musician. I almost kind of wonder, did a lot of people, musicians, and I think of like a Rick James or something, where they just saw Prince, and the way you sort of framed it, as a pop musician, a pop guy, pop music, and you hear maybe the bigger songs that were on the radio. You mentioned 1999 and When Doves Cry, but then some of the other stuff that wasn't maybe the super radio songs, but what I wouldn't necessarily consider pop. But I can see how it might be like, I don't know too much about this guy, but all the stuff that the people who are really into him know, they can only just kind of tell me like, no, dude, there's something deeper there. This guy is a dope musician. It's way more than what seems to be presented on the mainstream platform if you take the chance to look, right?
Absolutely. And that's obviously after all of the years that I've worked with Prince, I would even go so far as to say that my ability, my understanding of what a remarkable and at times brilliant musician he isn't necessarily something that I would have been able to conclude even from listening to all of the recorded music that he's done.
Wow. Okay.
And that's what kind of drew me into it. Now the other thing that for me, now you have to understand something. When I met Prince, I was 32 years old, and already had a career in music professionally of almost 15 years by then. And I had my own R&B, funk, and jazz bands in Pittsburgh, and while nobody outside of Pittsburgh ever heard of them, they were some of the more popular dance bar bands in Pittsburgh.
All right.
And I had gone through music school, and the level of musicianship of the teachers and people in music school were on such a high level. Whether it was classical music and jazz and things like that. So I had already been exposed to musicianship of the absolute highest level. So Prince wasn't the first remarkable musician that I had ever had the wonderful opportunity to be associated with. He was the next one. But, when you're 32 years old, you're already middle-aged when it comes to pop music. Or music. Right. So I understand why, for example, the musicians of for example, the Revolution, like Bobby Z and Matt Fink and Wendy and Lisa and those guys who were in their early 20s, who are being defined as the musicians that they are because of their association with Prince. And this is the first guy that they're exposed to, and that. So I get and understand why their absolute devotion and love for Prince's music, is what it is. But I came in from a different perspective, having, like I say, I already had my Princes. They were Ray and James and Miles and Wayne Shorter and Coltrane. You know, those were my Princes. So I was already defined as a musician. You know, who I was going to be as a musician had already kind of been determined by that. So it wasn't as if Prince's music was going to necessarily change me in any significant way, and it really didn't. Everything that I apologize for this sounding awfully self-serving and arrogant, but the fact is that any and everything that I needed to know as a saxophone player and a musician to be able to do whatever Prince ever needed me to do in service of his music, I knew how to do that the first day I met him. But that was a function as much of just my age and the experiences that I had already had. Now, my involvement with Prince was incremental because I went into him that first day, and this was for songs for the Family album. And I remember, you know, I'm kind of anal in how I keep track of events in my life and career, but also for business reasons. I kept a journal of almost every recording session I ever did with him.
Wow. That journal's probably worth about a couple houses right now.
Well, you know, it's my private journal. You know, maybe. Well, you know, maybe I'll write a book about it someday. I don't know, but anyway, and also just from a business sense, I kept track of it because I wanted to be sure that the session checks that I got, you know, reflected the actual time that I put in on every given session. So, you know, I had another motive.
Purse first, as we say.
Yeah, from a business sense. But I remember that first day because walked into the recording room with him, and Alan introduced me to him, and Prince said to me, he said, I have a cassette of some of the songs that I'd like to work with you on. Maybe you want to take the cassette and listen to it for a couple days. And I wasn't trying to be cocky or arrogant or anything, but I was just kind of a mind that, well, I'm here, I got my horn, I'm ready to roll if you are. And Prince kind of looked at me and he kind of smiled, and he said, okay, let's hit it. And that was it. So literally between the time I shook his hand and Alan said, Prince, this is my brother Eric. Eric, this is Prince. Literally within 5 minutes after that, tape was rolling, and we were going.
And you said these were songs with the Family?
These are songs of the Family, because that was what I was initially brought in to be a part of.
And real quick, was this before Purple Rain came out or after, or where was this at?
It was the album Purple Rain had just come out like a month before that. The movie was going to be premiered about a month after this was. I can tell you the date. It was July 2nd, 1984.
Wow. So let me just get, again, this is the master class for the Prince fans. So when you drop in dates, so we really got to get, so you're saying that y'all started working on the Family tracks. This is.
Well, he had the tracks done. This is the thing. And I'll tell you the four songs. For people who are into the Family album and know those songs backwards and forwards. The very first song that I did with Prince was the song that was called Desire.
Yes.
Now, it was actually had an alternate title. He was referring to the song at that point as ecstasy, which is a word that's in the lyric. But between the, so as we recorded that song, that's what it was referred to that day, ecstasy. By the time the album was released a year later, the song title had been changed to Desire. We did that.
Wow.
Then next we did High Fashion and Mutiny. And then we did the instrumental song that was called Susanna's Pajamas. That was on the album. Those were the first songs, the first four we did.
Heads are blown right now.
He had the tracks done. Now, what I'm listening to now, Paul Peterson had not yet put his vocals on it. Prince's vocals were on the songs.
Interesting. Now, some of that stuff has leaked out in terms of what the Prince's vocals.
That stuff has been bootlegged. Yeah, it's been out there for years. Yeah.
So that's interesting. We had Susan Rogers on last week, and we've talked.
Oh, sure. She was the engineer on that session.
Yeah.
Yep.
When we talked about some of those songs, now the song "Mutiny," from what you remember, now that you saying when this song was actually put together, it makes a lot of sense. So I'm assuming I can really say that song was an answer to Morris leaving the group.
Oh, absolutely. It was his message to Morris and to Jesse Johnson, who had also just left. It was his basically telling them, this was your ship, now it's mine. This is mutiny. I'm taking over.
It was Morris? Yeah. Did you get?
Did you get? Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, yeah. That's absolutely what that was about. Yeah.
Man. Wow. That's crazy. And I think, and then like the song Desire, we're just going to go in. So they took out the drums on the release version? Is that what it was or something? Because I heard a version where there's drums throughout the song. I mean,
I think the drums are more prominent in the original rough mix that I have from that session, because none of the strings were on it yet. You know, the Claire Fisher string arrangements weren't added for a couple months after that. And it was actually Susanna Melvoin and Wendy that came to Prince with the suggestion of. Hiring Claire Fisher was, absolutely one of the most well-known and respected jazz composers and arrangers in California to do the string arrangements. And it was really those string arrangements, I think, that really gave that album such a distinctive flavor. I think that the string arrangements are one of the most brilliant parts of that music. But yeah, I mean, there was a very prominent bass guitar that Prince had that was on the original versions of High Fashion and Mutiny, and he took the bass off.
Why do you think he did that? Like,
because it had been successful with When Doves Cry.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, I think that's now. Personally, I wish he had left the bass on. Because the bass that he played on those tracks was absolutely killer.
Nasty.
That's really, he was ripping it up. So I kind of wish that he had kept the bass on, but he didn't.
So a couple questions then. If this is the first things you worked on, how is it translated to you? The horn lines and different things. Are those things that you came up, or does he sitting here like humming them to you, or what?
Well, let me see. Desire was basically his line. The basic horn line. I think it was doubling. I'm not 100% sure if I haven't listened to the record in a long time. It might have been doubling a synthesizer line that might have already been there.
Gotcha.
So it's kind of an obvious thing to for that song to just double that. Now, obviously, all of the solos were mine because they were all just improvised. So basically, he said, "Okay, at this spot, I need you to do just an improvised solo, or whatever." High Fashion, of course, there's no horn lines in it. It's just a long solo at the end of the song. But I do recall that he had a specific way that he wanted me to set the solo up. I think if I recall that he said to me, he said, when you come in with the solo at the end of the song, I want you to just concentrate on 3 or 4 different notes. And just kind of keep it based and find kind of a motif of some sort based on that. And then after a few choruses or whatever, I'll give you a cue and cut you loose. And then from there, you can take it wherever you want to go with it.
Wow.
Which I think was an interesting idea of how to set the solo up to, the way it went. Mutiny, the little horn riff and that was his. Once again, there was a solo in the middle of it that was mine, and there was a solo at the end of it that was just improvised. Just improvised. But the main, the that line that was him. That was his. Susanna's Pajamas, it was just a track, and basically he just said, "Just play." And so I said, so there's no melody here, right? He said, no, there's not going to be a melody. You're just basically going to start soloing from the beginning and just solo through the whole song. So that's basically what that was. It was just there are a couple little things in the middle of it where he wanted me to double something that the bass was doing. But other than that, so I think what happened is he said, let me skip ahead to this part because there's a part that I want you to double what the bass is doing. So I listened to that and jotted down what the line was. So then we backed it up to the beginning. He said, just so you know where that comes. And I said, yeah, I got it. I know where that's going to come in. He said, okay, cool. Just roll it, and you got it. And so basically he hit play, and I just started playing, and basically it was one take. That was that. So,
one take. Wow.
Yeah.
Now, hearing those songs, what do you think now about him, his music? Is you still sort of like, oh, this pop dude is trying something different, or you're like, whoa, I didn't know it was like this? Or
well, like I say, it was incremental. I just I came away from here's the thing. Anything could have happened that day. Now he had told Alan that based on whatever Alan had played for him of mine, and I don't know, I don't really know what he played or how much, whether he gave him like an hour's worth or if he gave him 2 minutes, I don't know. Whatever Prince heard that gave him reason to want to call me and bring me up to Minneapolis to do the session, that was no guarantee that once we get in the room together, that necessarily he was, it could have been that he could have heard me play with him in the studio that day and said to himself, Eric really plays well, but maybe this just isn't what I'm looking for.